Greetings fellow tank commanders. In this video I'm going to be showing you the 3 parts of World of Tanks console's new War Stories campaign, Spoils of War. Each of these missions follows a different character from a different nation. For the first one we're going to be using a German character and be commanding a War Stories exclusive Panther tank. These War Story missions are quite long, so I've sped up the parts in between the action to make it as efficient as possible. Enjoy!
Black smoke on the horizon heralded the approach of the Soviets. The war was slowly grinding to a halt, but the end would not come quickly enough to spare the townsfolk from the wrath of the Red Army. The streets of Schwedt were now filled with people in panic. German High Command had instructed Captain Staupe to make a strategic withdrawal from Schwedt, but the town wouldn't let their defenders leave so easily. Staupe was well aware what this meant. Even if he did manage to push the Soviets back and save the town, his superiors would brand him a traitor and seek his immediate arrest. But that would have to wait for now. The defense of the town was his immediate priority. He would have to save worrying about saving his men and himself for later. Captain Staupe had sworn to protect the town from the Soviets at any cost. A new threat had appeared, with enemies approaching from the north. Enemy forces had been spotted near the lake. The relief in his men was clear to see. The building had been saved. The town was being attacked from a new direction. Captain Staupe ordered his tanks forward to meet this latest threat. Enemy reinforcements appeared in the south. More enemy units were advancing from the south.
Feuererlaubnis erteilt!
Reinforcements had arrived, just when it looked like the battle had been lost. With the enemy attacking from every direction, the situation looked dire for the defenders. Captain Stopa had realized the enemy was going to try outflanking them. Karl Staupe and his men had defended the town, but his defiance meant he could never fight alongside his unit again. The war was over. The Allies had won, but not with the sudden and expected capitulation of the Axis. Instead, the end had dragged on for far too long. The post-war victory reveille was now being subdued by the stark realization of how much had been lost on both sides. This had been a conflict which had made casualties of everyone. Yet there were still a few who could afford to enjoy their hard-earned spoils. Those who had seen an opportunity in the chaos that reigned around them and grabbed at it with both hands. Some would label it profiteering. They, however, would call it entrepreneurial. Captain Karl Staupe was still a hunted man, but chose to hide in plain sight. The money he accrued afforded him a comfortable lifestyle, but his funds were starting to run dry. He was forced to look for more work, and now risked everything by searching for it. The world was about to plunge into another conflict it wasn't ready for, an era that would reward those willing to be paid.
For the second mission, we're going to be following an American character and be commanding a War Stories exclusive Hellcat. Be careful, because you're going to have to do some city fighting with a mobile sniper.
The town of Kale sat on the opposite side of the Rhine River from the Allied forces. Sergeant Frank Martinez and his unit had been tasked with destroying the heavily fortified German headquarters located across the river. The only problem was, Martinez had other ideas. Martinez had a bold plan. He was going to liberate the stolen pieces of art and repatriate the more famous ones to their rightful owners. And if he could make a tidy profit off the small pieces in the meantime, then who could blame him? Martinez and his men thundered towards the enemy headquarters, unaware that the Germans had already mobilized their own tanks, filled to the brim with their prize. There was no way Sergeant Martinez was going to let the Germans destroy this vast wealth of cultural treasures on his watch. The only priority that mattered to Martinez was defeating the Germans and securing the strategic location.
Enemy in sight! Releasing target! Looks like that one went right through.
Martinez had to concentrate his search somewhere in this sector.
Enemy's got us in their sights. We've got them on. Loaded and ready. Crossing target. Penetration.
This area had been secured. Now, Martinez ordered his men to continue their search at the next sector. German armor was closing in fast on their position.
I see one of them. They've spotted us. We pierced their armor. Unlocking target. Enemy exposed. Enemy's looking right at us. That one drilled straight through. We finished him off. Enemy in sight. They've spotted us. Locked on. Penetration. Releasing targets. Track hit. Target locked. Looks like that one went right through. Chalk up another one.
Sergeant Martinez gave the order for his crew to attack the enemy units. With his next destination clear, Martinez ordered his tanks towards the city.
I see one of them. Enemy's looking right at us. Penetration.
There was no choice now. Martinez had to hunt down the escaping Germans before they could flee with the cultural treasures.
They've spotted us. Enemy exposed. Unlocking target. Target locked. I see one. One of our vehicles destroyed. Looks like that one went right through. That one did some damage. Releasing targets. Penetration. They found us. Dropping target. That was ricochet. Ready to fire on target. Looks like that one went right through. Releasing target. Heads up, artillery. The enemy knows our location. Target locked. That one drilled straight through. Locked on. I see one of them. Enemies looking right at us. We pierced their armor. Enemy armor is destroyed.
Frank Martinez and his crew had liberated the treasures out of the hands of the Germans and had given them back to their rightful owners. Well, nearly all of them anyway.
Great job, men.
The war was over. The Allies had won, but not with the sudden and expected capitulation of the Axis. Instead, the end had dragged on for far too long. The post-war victory reveille was now being subdued by the stark realization of how much had been lost on both sides. This had been a conflict which had made casualties of everyone. Yet there were still a few who could afford to enjoy their hard-earned spoils. Those who had seen an opportunity in the chaos that reigned around them and grabbed at it with both hands. Some would label it profiteering. They, however, would call it entrepreneurial. For Frank Martinez and his men, the end of the war gave them the chance to cash in on their liberated art collection. The payout had been substantial, and it gave Martinez a taste of the life he wanted. All he needed now was to be in the right place at the right time. The world was about to plunge into another conflict it wasn't ready for, an era that would reward those willing to be paid.
For this third mission, we're going to be following a Soviet character and be commanding a War Stories exclusive Object 261. I wasn't really sure what to expect from an artillery War Stories mission, so this is not my smoothest artillery gameplay.
The town of Dukla, home to a dogged pocket of German resistance. The advancing Red Army had been forced to halt and deal with this stubborn enemy. As the two sides exchanged blows from afar, the townsfolk found themselves being pushed steadily towards the brink of starvation. For one Soviet artillery captain, this was the final straw of a war which he had grown weary of. Unwilling to watch the population starve itself to death, Captain Anatoly Petrov had been running black market operations to and from the stricken town. It had proved a lucrative move, but one that came with enormous risks from both sides. Petrov knew he had a fight on his hands, but now he was going up against former comrades. If he was to escape the wrath of Stalin, he had no choice but to destroy the armored units bearing down on his position. Captain Petrov issued the orders to his comrades to mobilize. They would have to defend the town from the advancing NKVD. Enemy units were rushing towards the town. Petrov and his men were now the only thing standing in their way.
Орудие. Орудие готово к стрельбе. Не пробили. Огонь. Пробитие.
Scout units would play a critical role in spotting targets for Petrov's units to bombard.
Орудие заряжено. Критическое попадание. Орудие. Броня не пробита. Огонь!
It was no good. Petrov signaled his artillery units to move to a new position and find a more favorable line of sight.
К стрельбе готов. Выстрел! Есть попадание! Огонь!
The key to winning the day rested with Petrov being able to communicate correctly with the remainder of his allied batteries.
Не пробили! Орудие заряжено. Орудие. Броня не пробита. Выстрел. Критическое попадание. Есть попадание. Огонь. Готов. Есть. Орудие. Уничтожен. Пробитие. Орудие готово к стрельбе.
Petrov and his unit knew that once they opened fire, they'd be vulnerable to counter-battery fire.
Выстрел. Критическое попадание. Орудие заряжено. Огонь! Уничтожен. К стрельбе готов. Выстрел. Нет пробития. Уничтожен. Орудие. Готов. Орудие готово к стрельбе. Готов. Выстрел. Уничтожен. Орудие. Броня не пробита. Выстрел.
Petrov's men cheered with the NKVD units littering the battlefield. This had been a glorious day for the captain to remember.
Блестящая победа.
The war was over. The Allies had won, but not with the sudden and expected capitulation of the Axis. Instead, the end had dragged on for far too long. The post-war victory reveille was now being subdued by the stark realization of how much had been lost on both sides. This had been a conflict which had made casualties of everyone. Yet there were still a few who could afford to enjoy their hard-earned spoils. Those who had seen an opportunity in the chaos that reigned around them and grabbed at it with both hands. Some would label it profiteering. They, however, would call it entrepreneurial. The black market had proved too tempting for Anatoly Petrov. Even though the war had ended, he continued to ride his luck selling to those that needed it the most. It was only a matter of time before his luck would run out, but until then, he would take whatever he could. The world was about to plunge into another conflict it wasn't ready for, an era that would reward those willing to be paid.
After completing each of these War Stories missions, you're going to get access to an exclusive bundle for 24 hours. The first mission will give you access to a Panzer IV Hydrostat bundle. The second will give you access to the M4A2E4 Ripper bundle. And the third will give you access to the Honor T28E with F30 bundle. All of these bundles have great discounts on them, and they are really worth considering so you can add some fun new premium tanks to your garage. Just remember that these are only available for 24 hours after the first time you complete the War Stories mission, so if you come back and play it again in a week's time, it will not be available. Overall, I found this a fun War Stories campaign to play through. I liked having 3 similar stories from different angles, and I'm looking forward to trying all 3 of these missions again with some different tanks. Stay tuned for more awesome World of Tanks videos.